Listen to me. I'm gonna get off the phone right now, and I am going to let you professionals look at the situation and come back to me with a solution. No matter what, no matter what nobody said. Let's just here and there. Y'all are not working together the right way. We're losing.
I never told anyone. I never called the police. Anybody else would have said, Puff Daddy told me he's gonna kill me in the park. I think distrust came from that.
This footage was never supposed to change a sentence, but it just did. After Cassie's viral Netflix documentary, The Reckoning, new details surfaced that the court could no longer ignore, and as a result, Diddy's sentence was increased. What began as a streaming release has now crossed into legal consequence, and the shift happened faster than anyone expected. This wasn't a gradual build. It was a sudden fracture in a case many believed had already stabilized. What you're about to hear is not speculation, and it's not social media exaggeration. It's the exact sequence of moments where public exposure, documented behavior, and legal reassessment collided. And once you see how those pieces aligned, it becomes clear why this case is no longer reversible. Before we go any further, I want to know your perspective. Do you believe Cassie's Netflix footage directly influenced the court's decision, or was Diddy's sentence increase inevitable regardless of public reaction? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want clear, evidence-driven breakdowns of cases mainstream media avoids or delays, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence now. For months, Diddy's legal situation appeared contained. Lawyers spoke carefully. Statements were filtered. The narrative stayed narrow and procedural. But what The Reckoning did was remove insulation. It pulled moments out of sealed rooms and placed them in front of millions, uninterrupted, unedited, and emotionally raw. The documentary didn't rely on shock alone. It relied on chronology, behavior patterns, repetition, and that's what changed everything. Because when footage stops being isolated and starts forming a pattern, it stops being dismissible. Legal analysts immediately noted that several scenes previously referenced only indirectly in filings were now visible, contextualized, and time-stamped in a way that aligned disturbingly well with existing records. That alignment matters more than outrage. Courts don't move because something goes viral. They move when visibility exposes contradictions. And The Reckoning didn't introduce new allegations. It reframed existing ones in a way that made them impossible to compartmentalize. Behind the scenes, sources close to the legal process described a sudden urgency, not panic urgency, a need to reevaluate how certain moments were previously categorized. What was once labeled as character testimony began drifting into the territory of behavioral evidence. That shift alone carries consequences. And then came the timing. The footage didn't surface during a quiet phase. It emerged at a moment when sentencing considerations were still flexible, when supplemental material could still be reviewed, and when the court was actively weighing impact versus intent. That window was narrow, but the documentary hit it perfectly. What made Cassie's presence especially significant wasn't just her testimony, it was her consistency. The footage didn't contradict earlier statements, it reinforced them. Same language, same emotional markers, same sequence of events. That consistency stripped away one of the strongest defenses often used in cases like this, the claim of narrative drift over time. As legal commentators began dissecting the documentary, a pattern emerged in their language. Words like recontextualization, corroborative framing, and behavioral continuity started appearing repeatedly. These aren't buzzwords. They're signals indicators that something has crossed from perception into assessment. And that's when the conversation shifted from whether the footage should matter to whether it legally could be ignored. Once that threshold is crossed, the direction changes fast. What followed wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene or a sudden announcement. It was quieter than that. A recalibration, a review of how specific moments were weighted, and eventually a conclusion that what had been previously minimized could no longer be treated as peripheral. This is the part most people miss. Sentence increases don't happen because of one clip. They happen when multiple elements converge at the right moment. Visibility, timing, pattern recognition, and pressure not from the public, but from the evidence itself becoming unavoidable. By the time headlines caught up, the shift had already occurred internally, And this raises a far more uncomfortable question. If one documentary was enough to trigger reassessment, what happens if additional material surfaces? What happens if other voices follow the same trajectory of consistency and corroboration? Because if the reckoning proved anything, it's that silence was part of the strategy and exposure disrupted it. What looked like a controlled narrative has now become an open file. And once that door opens, it rarely closes again. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it didn't rely on a single emotional reaction. It triggered a chain reaction. Once the footage reframed earlier testimony, it forced a deeper look at material that had already been on record, but never fully interrogated. Details that once felt procedural suddenly carried weight. And when weight shifts in a case like this, everything downstream shifts with it. One of the most critical elements analysts pointed out was how the documentary altered the perception of intent. Previously, defense arguments leaned heavily on ambiguity, blurred timelines, conflicting interpretations, isolated incidents. But the reckoning compressed those gaps. By placing moments back to back, it reduced the space where doubt could live. That compression is subtle, but legally powerful. It transforms alleged behavior into a visible sequence, and sequence changes everything. When courts reassess sentencing, they don't just ask what happened. They ask how often, how consistently, and under what circumstances. The footage didn't answer those questions directly, it implied them. An implication, when supported by existing documentation, is enough to justify reweighting prior conclusions. There's also a psychological component that rarely gets discussed publicly. Judges are human. They're trained to filter emotion, but they're also trained to recognize patterns of harm. When testimony moves from text to visual context, it bypasses abstraction. It becomes experiential. That doesn't mean decisions become emotional. It means they become harder to distance from reality. This is where Cassie's role becomes pivotal. Her presence in the documentary wasn't framed as a reaction. It was framed as recollection. Calm, measured, consistent. And consistency is what courts value most. Not volume, not outrage. Consistency. When someone recounts events the same way across years, across platforms, and under different pressures, it weakens claims of fabrication or exaggeration. Legal experts noted that several phrases used in the documentary mirrored language found in earlier depositions. That matters because it suggests alignment rather than adaptation. It suggests memory rather than performance. And once that interpretation takes hold, it reshapes how credibility is assessed retroactively. Another overlooked factor is how public documentation influences internal review processes. When footage becomes widely available, it doesn't just inform the public, it invites scrutiny from independent analysts, former prosecutors, and legal scholars who begin mapping what they see against known standards. That external analysis doesn't directly affect sentencing, but it creates an ecosystem of interpretation that courts are aware of. And courts do not operate in isolation. At the same time the documentary gained traction, conversations began surfacing around what was not included in earlier proceedings. Not suppressed evidence, but sideline context. Moments deemed irrelevant at the time suddenly appeared relevant when viewed through a broader behavioral lens. That doesn't mean the case was mishandled initially. It means new framing exposed blind spots. Blind spots are dangerous in high-profile cases because once acknowledged, they invite correction. The reassessment that followed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, quiet, supplemental, but its implications were severe. Sentence increases are rarely symbolic. They reflect a recalculated understanding of impact. They suggest that harm was deeper, broader, or more sustained than previously recognized. And that recalculation didn't emerge from outrage. It emerged from coherence. This is why attempts to dismiss the documentary as media influence miss the point. Media didn't create new facts. It reordered existing ones. And when facts are reordered, meaning changes. There's also the issue of precedent. High-profile cases set tone. Courts are acutely aware that how they respond sends signals not to the public, but to future cases. Ignoring widely corroborated behavioral framing risks, appearing disconnected from evolving standards of accountability, and no institution moves comfortably into that position. So the sentence increase wasn't reactive. It was preventative. a way of aligning outcome with perception before that gap became too wide to justify. Still, the most unsettling aspect of this development lies ahead. Because the reckoning wasn't exhaustive, it didn't claim to be. It focused on a specific narrative arc, leaving other threads untouched. And when one arc proves influential, attention inevitably shifts to what remains unexplored. That's where uncertainty grows. If one documentary was enough to prompt reassessment, the question becomes, what else exists that hasn't yet been contextualized? What material sits dormant because it hasn't been framed in a way that forces reconsideration? This is the paradox of visibility. Once exposure proves effective, silence becomes suspicious, and silence has consequences. The narrative surrounding Diddy's case is no longer controlled by statements or legal pacing. It's shaped by interpretation, by how moments connect, by how absence speaks as loudly as presence. At this stage, the case isn't just about accountability, it's about trajectory, where this reassessment leads, whether it stabilizes here or continues to evolve as new context emerges. Because what the reckoning demonstrated is that the story people thought they understood was incomplete, and incomplete stories have a way of resurfacing again and again until they're fully told. What's happening now is less visible, but far more consequential. Once a case enters this phase, the focus quietly shifts from what has already been shown to what could still emerge. Legal teams don't just react to evidence, they anticipate trajectories. And the trajectory here changed the moment the documentary reframed the narrative in a way that stuck. Behind closed doors, the question stopped being whether the footage mattered and became how far its implications could extend. Because when behavior is reinterpreted as a pattern rather than a collection of incidents, it invites expansion. It encourages reviewers to ask whether the existing scope of evaluation was too narrow. And when that happens, everything surrounding the case is viewed through a different lens. This is where institutional memory comes into play. High-profile cases like this don't exist in isolation. They sit within a larger archive of outcomes, reversals, and corrections. Judges and review panels are deeply aware of moments in history where early restraint was later criticized as oversight. That awareness doesn't create bias, it creates caution. And caution, in this context, means ensuring that no element capable of altering interpretation is left unexamined. The documentary accelerated that process, not because it introduced shock, but because it introduced continuity. Viewers weren't just shown moments, they were shown progression. Emotional tone didn't spike randomly, it evolved. And that evolution mirrored timelines already present in legal filings. When visual narrative and legal chronology begin to overlap, the result's a kind of validation that's difficult to ignore. Another factor gaining quiet attention is corroboration through absence. In several key moments highlighted by analysts, there was no substantial contradiction from opposing accounts. Silence, when expected to be filled, becomes informative. And in legal reassessment, what isn't challenged can carry almost as much weight as what is affirmed. That absence doesn't imply admission, but it narrows defensive ground. As scrutiny deepened, commentary shifted away from individual credibility and towards systemic behavior. Instead of asking whether one account was believable, the question became whether the system had adequately measured cumulative impact. That's a far more complex issue, and one that often results in recalibration rather than reversal. This distinction matters, because recalibration doesn't suggest error, it suggests refinement. It implies that earlier conclusions were made with incomplete perspective. And when new perspective emerges, especially one that aligns multiple strands of information, refinement becomes necessary. That necessity is what shaped the current stage of the case. Another subtle but powerful influence has been peer interpretation. Legal professionals don't operate in silos. They observe how colleagues respond to similar developments, how frameworks evolve, and how accountability standards shift over time. When a case as visible as this one prompts widespread analytical consensus, even informally, it sends a signal that resonates beyond any single courtroom. Consensus doesn't need to be unanimous to be influential. It only needs to be consistent. And consistency is exactly what emerged in post-documentary analysis. Different voices, different platforms, same conclusion. The framing changed the weight of what was already known. That convergence creates momentum. Momentum doesn't force decisions, but it makes stasis uncomfortable. Remaining static in the face of evolving interpretation risks future criticism not from the public, but from history. And legal systems are designed to minimize that risk wherever possible. At this point, attention is also turning toward secondary implications. How this reassessment might affect related proceedings. Whether it alters how testimony is evaluated in adjacent cases. Whether it encourages others to step forward, not with new allegations, but with additional context that reinforces existing ones. Because once one narrative gains traction, parallel narratives feel safer emerging. This is often how expansions begin, not with new accusations, but with clarification. People who previously stayed silent don't suddenly speak to accuse. They speak to contextualize, and contextualization can be just as impactful. What's particularly striking is how the conversation has moved away from personality and toward process. Early discourse focused heavily on image, reputation, and celebrity. Now the emphasis is on mechanisms, how behavior was interpreted, how patterns were weighted, how impact was measured. That shift signals maturation in the narrative, and maturity is when consequences solidify. There's also an undercurrent of inevitability forming. Not inevitability of a specific outcome, but inevitability of continued scrutiny. Once a case demonstrates that reassessment is possible, it becomes an example. And examples invite comparison. Comparison invites reevaluation. This doesn't mean the situation will escalate endlessly. It means the period of dormancy is over. The case has re-entered an active interpretive phase, where developments are shaped not just by new information, but by new understanding of old information. Understanding evolves, and with it, outcomes adjust. Perhaps the most telling sign of this shift is the change in language used around the case. Terms once reserved for speculation are now used cautiously in analytical contexts. The tone has moved from questioning to measuring, from debating credibility to assessing impact. That's not accidental. It's procedural. And procedure, unlike outrage, doesn't burn out. As this phase continues, the spotlight is likely to intensify on areas that were once considered peripheral. Relationships, timelines, decisions that, in isolation, seemed inconsequential but, in sequence, suggest something else entirely. Because once sequence becomes the lens, nothing exists alone. And that's the reality Diddy's case now faces: not a surge of attention, but a sustained, methodical examination driven by reframing rather than revelation. The story isn't accelerating because of noise. It's deepening because of structure. And when structure replaces speculation, outcomes stop being hypothetical. They become procedural. At this stage, the case has moved into a zone where outcomes are shaped less by headlines and more by accumulation. Accumulation of interpretation, accumulation of context, accumulation of unanswered questions. This is the phase where systems quietly decide how far they're willing to go and how far they're willing to be seen not going. What's important to understand is that sentence increases rarely exist in isolation. They tend to signal something broader, a recalibrated tolerance. When a court adjusts its position after visibility changes, it's acknowledging that earlier frameworks no longer fully apply. That acknowledgement doesn't just affect one individual, it alters how similar cases are approached going forward. And that's why this moment matters beyond Diddy himself. Because what the reckoning ultimately disrupted wasn't just a narrative, it disrupted predictability. For a long time, the trajectory of this case felt managed, controlled, linear. But once reframing entered the picture, linearity broke down. The path forward became conditional rather than fixed. Conditional on what emerges next, conditional on how existing material is interpreted, conditional on whether silence continues to hold. One of the most consequential shifts now underway is the reassessment of responsibility. Early conversations focused on isolated accountability, individual moments, individual claims, individual defenses. Now the focus is expanding toward sustained influence and long-term impact. That expansion widens the scope of consequence dramatically, because sustained influence implies sustained awareness, and awareness introduces responsibility. This is where public misunderstanding often creeps in. People assume that once sentencing occurs, the story's effectively over. But sentencing is not closure, it's calibration. It reflects the court's best understanding at a specific moment in time. When that understanding changes, calibration changes with it. What we're seeing now is a recalibration driven by coherence. The footage didn't overwhelm the system, it aligned with it. It fit into gaps that were already there. It answered questions that had been floating without resolution, and when unanswered questions suddenly find context, they demand adjustment. There's also the matter of institutional credibility. Legal systems are acutely aware that credibility is built not on perfection, but on responsiveness. Refusing to adapt in the face of clearer understanding risks eroding trust, not public trust, but internal legitimacy. Systems must be able to say, with new clarity, we reassessed. That's what happened here. And once that precedent is set, it lingers. Future cases will reference this moment, not explicitly, but structurally. Analysts will ask whether similar patterns were present, whether similar reframing could have altered outcomes elsewhere, and whether earlier restraint should always be maintained when visibility changes interpretation. This is how one case ripples outward. Another development quietly unfolding is the redefinition of what constitutes new information. Traditionally, new information meant undisclosed facts or newly surfaced evidence. But the reckoning challenged that definition. It demonstrated that new framing of existing information can be just as impactful as new material. That's a subtle but powerful shift, because it means cases are no longer insulated by the passage of time alone. If interpretation evolves, relevance can resurface. And that introduces a level of unpredictability that high-profile defendants rarely anticipate. Unpredictability changes behavior. It affects strategy. It affects silence. It affects how future narratives are constructed. For Diddy's case, this means the window of stability has closed, not because something explosive happened, but because something clarifying did, and clarity removes room to maneuver. There's also an emotional undercurrent that cannot be ignored, not emotion as reaction, but emotion as recognition. Recognition of harm. Recognition of pattern. Recognition that earlier categorizations may have underestimated cumulative effect. That recognition doesn't require outrage to operate. It simply requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement has weight. What complicates matters further is the possibility of parallel reassessments. When one case demonstrates that reframing can alter outcomes, others take notice. People connected peripherally may revisit their own experiences, not necessarily to accuse, but to contextualize. And context, again, reshapes interpretation. This doesn't guarantee escalation, but it guarantees attention. Attention is the currency of accountability. As this phase continues, the narrative will likely become quieter, fewer dramatic spikes, fewer viral moments, but far more consequential. Quiet doesn't mean inactive. It means procedural. It means deliberative. It means decisions being shaped in rooms far from cameras. Those decisions tend to be durable, and durability is what defines legacy outcomes. What the reckoning exposed wasn't just a sequence of events, it exposed a structural vulnerability in how narratives are compartmentalized. It showed that separating moments from patterns can delay consequence, but not eliminate it. Once moments are reassembled, consequence follows. That's the reality now setting in. The question is no longer whether the sentence increase matters. It does. The question is whether it represents a stopping point or a marker of where reassessment began, not where it ended. History suggests markers matter more. Because markers are referenced, they're cited, they become benchmarks against which future decisions are measured. And this one sits at a critical intersection: celebrity, visibility, accountability, and evolving standards of interpretation. No matter what happens next, the narrative arc has changed permanently. The case will never return to its earlier framing. The assumptions that once held no longer apply. And once assumptions collapse, structures must adapt. Adaptation is rarely comfortable, but it is necessary. As viewers, observers, and analysts, what we're witnessing isn't the collapse of a story, it's the completion of a reframing that forces systems to respond not to noise, but to coherence. And coherence is relentless. It doesn't fade, it doesn't outrage, It simply persists. Which brings us back to the central issue this case now represents: not whether justice was delayed, but whether justice is capable of evolving when clarity demands it. That's the question this moment leaves behind. If you followed this breakdown to the end, I want to hear your take. Do you believe this sentence increase marks the final recalibration in Diddy's case? Or is it only the beginning of a broader reassessment driven by reframing rather than new evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want in-depth, evidence-focused analysis that cuts through speculation and follows cases beyond the headlines, make sure you subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. New breakdowns drop regularly, and the stories don't stop where the news does.